Hannah, welcome to the Policy Scoop.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hello. Yeah, so happy to have you with us, Hannah.
Yeah, we've been working on getting you on the show for a while. Now it's finally happened. It took us a few months, but you're here.
I'm finally here.
You're finally here. And there is a lot to talk about. I mean, obviously, Frontier is the second biggest buyer in the space and probably the buyer that has bought from most companies or has gathered probably the most experience in buying. And so, yeah, we're super keen to get your take. And wherever we obviously a policies podcast, we're going to talk about a lot of things. I'd love to hear how you and Frontier also looks at the policy world and how it's evolving. But really, maybe to get us started, because I know that you've just released your latest innovation program, the call for proposals, and maybe just there, summing it up, like how did you design this innovation program based on kind of lessons that you've learned from the past? Like where are you at today, basically?
Yeah, this is a fun one to talk about because we've been running some form of an innovation program or a pre-purchase program for a long time. In fact, Stripe started doing pre-purchases of carbon removal even before we launched Frontier. So back in 2019, we started some flavor of this program, and we've actually just, for this year, redesigned it. So it's like a good moment to chat about what we're up to. The carbon removal field has made such incredible progress over that time. So when we launched Frontier in 2022, we published an R&D gaps database to kind of help the field organize its thinking around what the big scientific questions are that need to be answered in order for carbon removal to kind of move from a lab science to more of a commercial scale market. And when we went back and reviewed that, something like 60% of those gaps have been worked on or solved. So just like an amazing coverage in a short period of time. And so we kind of started to think about, like, what should our innovation program this year look like? And we're trying to meet the market where it is. And so that means two things. One, we're broadening from just pre-purchases. So we will now do early stage purchases, and explicitly we will do R&D grants as well. And kind of to help facilitate that expansion, our check sizes will also become a lot more flexible. So historically, we would do $500K pre-purchase checks to early stage companies to buy tons in the future. And now, basically, we're just going to be a lot more flexible in how and what we fund. And hopefully, the goal of that is that it allows us to both do more academic research and sort of upstream of pre-purchases and a few larger pre-purchases, so perhaps downstream of where we once were. So sort of expanding the purview of our innovation program.
And did that emerge because these were the challenges you saw, like where you needed to expand, that like you needed to focus also on the very like early stage things that necessarily were not within your realm before?
Yeah, I think what we're learning is that while pre-purchases are a super powerful tool, so the original theory behind a pre-purchase, and really behind a lot of what we do at Frontier, is that there's not an obvious customer for carbon removal. So if we can buy the tons that a company is producing, even at very small scale, and ideally if we can pay ahead for those tons, that itself is very catalytic. That allows that company to go and raise money and hire great people. And obviously, we started with pre-purchases, and then when we launched Frontier, we expanded into offtake agreements, which are the large multi-million-dollar, multi-year agreements. And that does work and has worked. And there's lots of signals that that theory of change has led to a lot of innovation in the carbon removal space and a lot more startups getting started. But pre-purchases also are only one tool. And when you're looking at some of the academic questions, like how much alkalinity can you add to the water before you have secondary precipitation impacts? That's not really a perfect pre-purchase question. And we were finding ourselves kind of shoehorning certain deals into this pre-purchase structure and realized, like, that's not totally necessary. We can fund some of those more scientific questions more sort of with a more focused R&D prompt.
I really like that. I know that if I think about Carbon to C, right, another very important catalytic institution in the sector, they've gone very deep on the academic side, right, and finding researchers to kind of answer those questions. So it's interesting that, like, I'm not surprised that you kind of ended up where you are in terms of that challenge, but I am surprised that you decided to step into it. So yeah, what percentage of, I guess, the funding for this year will go towards kind of the academic research side?
Yeah. So in general, our innovation program is a relatively small amount of money relative to our program. So to give you a sense, in 2025, we did $10 million of pre-purchases and $255 million worth of offtakes. So it's like
That's a lot.
yeah, it's a smaller portion. Obviously, $10 million in these early stage projects goes really, really far. And so you can imagine we're going to do a similar magnitude of funding, and we actually haven't predetermined how much of it will go to R&D versus to pre-purchase. It's really going to be looking at the applications that we've received. We've already received a bunch of really great and compelling projects, and funding to what we think best meets the gaps that we're excited about. So the alkalinity application problem I talked about, we're really excited about better MRV tools. So increasing the precision and the scalability of how we do measurement for open systems. We're excited about studying mineralization efficiency for surficial mineralization approaches. So like anything in kind of those categories, we'll just fund to the project.
I'm curious to explore the theory of change, and specifically digging into your expectations on how, like, what kind of policy tools does Frontier expect to support what you put on the table? Because you were just describing, in this case, 10 million for pre-purchasing, 25 for offtakes, but you're doing it in the context of a bigger picture, right? You want to have the biggest impact you can. So you're catalyzing something, but then what do you expect to become available in different jurisdictions to take things to the next level?
Yeah, we talk a lot about what we call this concept is the baton pass. So what is the role of Frontier and what are we trying to achieve in this market? And then where is the handoff? To whom and to which jurisdictions, and like what does that look like? Because I think we can all agree, though tell me if you don't agree, that carbon removal is ultimately going to be, and is today, a public good. And so at scale, and certainly to get to the scale that we think the world is going to need to reach sort of global net zero targets, carbon removal is going to have to be a government-supported market. And so we see our role as Frontier, and really like as voluntary corporate buyers today, as really pulling technology from lab to field, helping those companies build their first demos, maybe their first commercial scale facility, and kind of in some ways get the technology ready such that as policy is developing in parallel, there is a portfolio of solutions that policymakers can use, can point to, can regulate, can mandate on the other end, because we're sort of not quite there yet. I would say the technologies today are just too unproven, too sort of technically risky today for really large scale sort of policy regimes to take over. So we see ourselves as sort of preparing the market for that inevitable future. That's kind of the big picture. But you asked, like, what exactly are we looking for? Like, what do we want those governments to write into law? And, I would say we're pretty sort of policy agnostic. We've seen a bunch of different jurisdictions come up with different policy tools for accelerating carbon removal. And for the most part, they all would be great. Like, to us, it's a little bit the more the merrier. And whatever jurisdictions think like fits into their policy regime, their sort of cultural mindset around carbon removal. So is it compliance markets? Is it contracts for difference? Is it direct subsidies? Is it direct federal procurement? I kind of think there's a role for any of that to play we would just say like, yes, governments should be buying, should be subsidizing, should be supporting carbon removal. And ideally, it should be tech agnostic.
It's interesting though, because when I think about the role that you are playing and where you're, I think we need everything you guys are doing, right? But if I think about what are the biggest gaps you're filling that nobody else is filling, it's really for that early stage innovation, the higher risk bets, right? Because the like I think about Frontier and I think about Milky Wire, and it's almost that it's kind of the first money, the first capital that often these startups get comes from either you or from Milky Wire, right? And it's a huge stamp of approval as well for them. And that's the kind of projects and startups that are very hard to fund through government efforts. Like, of course, there is some R&D money, but from what I see, there's a lot of risk aversion in government for good reasons, because they don't want to end up on the front page of a tabloid, right?
Taxpayer money.
Exactly. And so when I look at kind of the bigger government programs, it's almost like they're only going to take the most mature technologies that have already proven themselves for years. And so I found always that the work you do, especially on the earlier stage ones, and the fact that you can take risks that a government probably can't, that has been incredibly valuable to the industry. But obviously, without your big offtakes, it also would be very hard to scale those solutions, right? So that's why I want to say it takes everything. But I think that's a role that I see as personally as the most valuable.
Yeah, it's both sort of actual early stage funding, which is what our innovation program is. And then as we think about our offtake program, a lot of it is about how do we buy from the types of projects or the types of technologies that we think are most likely to be part of a gigaton scale future. And that often means that we're sort of putting new pathways on the map commercially. So we did the first commercial deal in ocean alkalinity enhancement last year with Planetary. We also did a pre-purchase with them before that. And that was sort of the early stage money, first check-in type of idea. But it's really that offtake agreement that starts to signal to buyers and to governments and to investors, like this pathway is more ready for commercial scale, or sort of moving into commercial scale.
If you look at, so you're obviously, well, you're looking at a lot of early stage projects, but I'm not sure if it's only that. I'm just curious if you look at the government's purchasing programs, do you see a likelihood that at some point, I mean, because obviously working at removals, the only thing we see is that there is not enough funding going into the projects and we don't have enough projects on the ground. But do you also see sometimes steps taken that rather would kind of crowd out advanced market commitment style private sector action compared to helping to crowd it in? Or not necessarily, that hasn't happened so far?
In a way, I'm trying to think if I have an example of that. I mean, you can think of the Brevik project in Norway, for example, as one that was largely funded on both the CapEx and the OpEx side by the Norwegian government, and so didn't really need additional corporate buyers, or certainly not that many corporate buyers, in order to make the project work. But my understanding, and I'm willing to be corrected here, of course, is that the Norwegian government was sort of making an example of Brevik, saying we can do CCS and we can do the capture effectively, and then we can do the transport and we can store it in the North Sea, and the whole end-to-end program should work. And therefore, okay, industry, go forth and prosper. We've made you an example. We've paid for the example. You all can copy and paste now. And so I think that's actually a really great example of crowding in more private investment to the broader sort of pathway or sort of technical approach, even if the Brevik project itself was largely paid for by the government. That is really unusual. I can't think of any other examples. And in general, I think the public-private collaboration, we need a lot more of it. And we can talk about our work with Exergy and with Hafslund Celsio, which are sort of examples of a more partnered approach.
And do you actively work with specific jurisdictions when it comes to government? Because obviously I know that Frauke, for example, has been involved in the CSCF expert group, right? But so I'm curious, how do you choose where to lean in when it comes to policy?
Yeah, it's hard because ultimately we would like to be everywhere. And we think that there should be sort of supportive government policy for carbon removal in lots and lots of jurisdictions. But we try to prioritize in the places where we think there is already some momentum, some understanding, some high level of education, such that there's a good likelihood that there will be some sort of supportive policy in place. So we right now spend a lot of time, I think, in the EU being like one of our primary targets. There's a lot of work being done by the EU Commission, as you two know much better than I do. Norway, the UK, Sweden, Canada, to some degree the US. Those are probably like our sort of, as we would think, sort of tier one, like lots and lots and lots of activity happening. But we also keep an eye on places like Japan, the UAE, Australia, Germany, all have kind of signaled some interest.
Can I ask how you get involved in those tier one countries? Because obviously you have such a wealth of experience, but do you like actually do visits to the capitals, show up, talk to people in the ministries? Like, what does it look like, policy at Frontier?
Yeah, I mean, you should really talk to Danny Broberg on my team, who leads all of our policy work. And he is sort of everywhere all at once and is often visiting these different jurisdictions and having lots of sort of direct one-to-one conversations with policy members. We also participate in a number of different sort of advocacy groups. We help to co-found CRA, Carbon Removal Alliance in the US. We participate in NEP, in ZEP. One of our Stripe fellows, Alex Michaela, started the Nordic Carbon Removal Alliance. We have great relationships with DESNES. So individually and then sort of via other advocacy groups, we're highly involved. You know, government is the end game for carbon removal. And so if nothing we do at Frontier will matter if we don't find enough government support for these types of technologies in the long term. We just don't believe the voluntary carbon market will scale to the size required. So we spend a lot of time on this.
Now, given the experience you already have gained over these years, right, when Frontier has been active, and even prior to that, just with Stripe, you've established like a lot of specific criteria for your due diligence process. And I'm just curious, have you, like, how much of that has been shared that potentially like could be taken up also by the governments as they go about designing their policies? I think one of the examples, obviously, that already comes together from our conversation here is Frauke and her involvement in the CRCF expert group. But how else are you feeding your findings and your work into the government kind of policy development process in different jurisdictions?
Yes. So the best example is definitely the Frauke example, where we sit on technical working groups or we give sort of expert opinions on specific legislation that is being drafted. And, you know, that's a lot of what we're spending our time on when we're visiting different countries and talking to governments, is really talking to them about our experience in the field with technologies. The second thing I would say is we publish a lot of our sort of buying principles by pathway. So a really good example would be biomass sourcing principles. We have really strong opinions about what good looks like when it comes to sustainable waste biomass sourcing, and have outlined that, and would love for that type of material to be picked up by governments that are looking to regulate BECS and bikers projects, and certainly have given a lot of perspective on that to the recent BECS protocol that came out from the CRCF. And then I guess the third way, which is sort of more indirect, is we do a lot of work with the registries who are writing the protocols, who are also working with governments. And so we spend a lot of time with folks at Isometric and at Puro, both for the delivery of the tons that we are buying, but also to make sure that there's sort of a global standard for what good looks like in all of these different pathways and technologies that we feel really good about.
And I mean, there's a lot of ground we already covered, but if I can switch gears and go a little bit back to what you said earlier, I know last year you selected a bunch of fellows, right? And you mentioned Alexander, who set up the Nordics Association, and I thought that was a really interesting, initiative where you basically selected a bunch of individuals, gave them some money for 1 year, with the intent of generating demand for carbon removal, as if I recall correctly.
Perfect.
Maybe kind of, did it work? And are you gonna do it again?
So, you described it very well. And the theory there was kind of exactly what you asked me before, which is like, how do we prioritize where to spend our time? And it's an impossible prioritization. And really what you need is people, boots on the ground, with local expertise and local relationships to be super successful. And so the theory was find great people all around the world who can kind of carry the torch rather than trying to hire 9 or 10 or 11 full-time employees on our team. I think it was a very ambitious goal to sort of meaningfully change the demand landscape for carbon removal in 1 year via policy tools. I think policy moves slowly, and perhaps it should move slowly because the stakes are very high. And so I think we had somewhat mixed ability to be successful in that short period of time. I think the Nordic Carbon Removal Alliance, or NCRA, is like actually a great win from that time. I don't know if we'll run it again, to be honest. I think it is very hard to affect change on such a short period of time. And so this year we're starting to think much more about building relationships sort of via advocacy groups, hiring more intentionally in-house more slowly. But, the world is a big place to cover, and I don't think we've nailed it yet.
Yeah, but I did think when you announced the program that it's a really, really bold step. And it's great to see that there are companies, willing, or their organizations willing to take on the risk, because I'm not sure, I had not seen that being done ever before like this. And I myself, I'm, obviously for a long time with a policy background. And it is tricky, right? Policy moves way slower than usually people in the private sector expect. But I would just like to congratulate you on the efforts that you put into this, even if the outcome wasn't necessarily exactly what you expected. And definitely Nordic Carbon Removal Alliance. Great organization, and I also have great relationship with them. So I'm very happy that you actually made it happen.
Thank you for that.
So as we are getting closer to the end of the session, I was wondering if there is a specific a policy or market failure that is in your wish list that you would like to see addressed, to help kind of bring down the removal prices in the next, let's say, 5 years. Something burning that you feel like should get more attention than it's getting today.
Well, there are so many things that I could talk to that range from what I think are practical to the sort of ideal land, but to choose one that I think is more practical, we've talked a bit about this today, but really being tech agnostic in the policies that we develop. I think from our experience, diligencing companies, watching companies deploy and deliver in the field for the first time, it's been very clear that we are going to need a portfolio of solutions to deliver gigaton scale carbon removal. And while we have learned so much in the last couple of years of work that we've been doing, we still don't yet know with very high conviction exactly what is going to work and what is not. And so we should be developing policy frameworks that are accelerative to the overall market and incentivize the most scalable, most efficient, most cheap solutions to be tried in the field and to scale as quickly as possible. And so I think setting it up so that we are not specifying specific technologies or specific pathways is the best way to do that.
Is there a contradiction in what you just said? Because when I think about the most scalable, the cheapest solutions today, if that's my criteria, then I'm probably not going to support a broad range of technologies. Right? I find that actually you have to differentiate, because otherwise it's a kind of, you're just going to, the cheapest today or most effective today will get all the funding.
Yeah, I'm really glad you called that out, because what I mean to say is the cheapest and the most scalable in the future. We should be looking at the potential of these technologies and giving them a chance to get there, because we want to bet on all the good horses. We don't want to cut ourselves off today based on what we know, which we know for sure is an incomplete picture. So I think, in our annual letter, we talked about surficial mineralization being a technology that we're excited about, but we don't see getting so much attention or certainly so much deployment in the field. And that is an example of a technology that we do not want to be left behind. Maybe it won't work. Maybe we'll find that the mineralization efficiency is too low, the costs are too high, it's too hard to permit. It could fall apart for all sorts of reasons, but we should at least try. And so certainly as we're developing policies, that will continue to be true sort of even as we work down the funnel. So we fund early stage innovation. Those companies go on to build their demonstration facilities and then their commercial scale facilities and then their second of and their third of. And we should not be overly narrowing before we are sure.
I feel this brings us kind of full circle in this overall conversation today, because you mentioned the role of frontier, like in the early stages, like taking some risks, looking at very new solutions. Sebastian mentioned that governments oftentimes are going for those CDR methods that are already proven. If you mentioned that we should be more technology agnostic and more broad when we design policies, it's very obvious that policymakers will want to have a cutoff somewhere, because they don't want to support something that is too early or too uncertain. So where would you draw the line? Like, is it a TRL level, something else?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's good to clarify that what we mean by tech agnostic is not to mean that the government has to take all sorts of risky bets, but rather we should write our legislation and our frameworks to take into account that there will be more innovation. So we shouldn't be determining the guardrail by technology type, but to your point, maybe it's by TRL, maybe it's by number of tons deployed and registered. Maybe, the CRCF is doing great work to write lots of new protocols and methodologies for pathways that should ultimately qualify in the framework. And that's great work. We should be thinking about how do we continue to expand what's possible so that if those technologies are successful, and certainly if those technologies are more successful than what we have today, the policies in place will work. So we should just be writing them with an expansive mindset at the outset.
One more question, which is probably on many people's minds. What happens after 2030 for Frontier?
It's certainly on our minds as well, and we're working hard on that. I don't think there's that much I can say about it, except we are doing a lot of work this year to think about what is the story, or what is the strategy for post-2030. We certainly want to continue to buy carbon removal, ensure the buyers in Frontier continue to buy carbon removal post-2030, and set up our projects such that they have the demand both on the voluntary side and on the government side to be successful. So perhaps like a bit of a vague answer, and I'm sorry about that, but
we wish you luck in convincing all these
corporates. It's on our mind,
because everyone wants you to continue beyond 2030. So
okay, well, good to know. Good hype. Yeah, maybe I'll be back next time with more to say.
I would love that.
Cool.
All right. I think we can wrap it up here. It was a really, really good conversation. A little bit of a behind the scenes to Frontier, which I enjoyed a lot. So, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, have a nice rest of your day.
Yeah, thank
you.
you all for having me.